Today I came out to the shed hoping to get a few things done. The first thing was get all the brake shoes in place, and I thought, I know how that works, that's not going to take me very long. Then I can go on to some of the oil piping and maybe even do a bit more cleanup on the Land Rover. But the brakes ended up taking me all day because these things always take a lot longer than you think they're going to take. The main problem was just first figuring out how it all went together and just to make sure I did have all of the parts. So if we look at one of these brake setups, there's two brake shoes, of course, and they're pivoted at the back, and there's a sort of cam at the front. And these bolts at the back are different lengths. The ones on the back are slightly longer. So the bolts stick out a little bit further. And on the saloon cars, there's actually a metal plate that goes here. And I'm not entirely certain what that's for. It may be some kind of jacking point or something. I do have those plates somewhere in my pile of bits. I've left them off for now because I don't believe the Brooklands had those. So those have been left off. Getting the brake shoes in place was mostly okay, but a little tiny bit tricky on one of them. So the way this works is the shoes are aluminium, and there's a stainless steel sleeve that sort of fits inside there, and then this bolt goes through, and this bolt is kind of a shoulder bolt. So there is a plain section that goes inside that bush, and it is fractionally longer than the bush, so that when all of this is bolted up, the shoes are free to pivot on this point. And what I ended up discovering was one of them was binding up when I was doing it up tight, and it was because that shoulder was fractionally too short. I did do a little bit of mixing and matching of parts to see if I could get a set that would work, just moving things around, but no, it turned out that bolt was slightly wrong. So I ended up having to fix that by machining. There's only a few thou off the inside face of the top of these bolts, one of those bolts, and that fixed that, no problem. The other thing was just making sure you've got all the right washers and bits and pieces in place. And on the rear here, and also on the front ones, it's a little bit tricky to see, but inside there in the parts book it shows a leather washer, and when you assemble the parts you can see there is a gap there. So I laser cut my own, basically, just thick leather, which I then soaked in oil for an hour or so while I was doing everything else, and that seems to have taken care of that. All of these levers and things are handed, so the cams are handed, you have to get those the right way around. These levers are slightly offset in one direction, and these return springs will only fit one way around as well. It took a little bit of puzzling with that to realize how that worked, but obviously these are the springs that retract the brake shoes, or rather retract the cam. So the spring here is what pulls the brake shoes together, but you also need something to return the cam to its rest position. The interesting thing with these, and I don't know if this means I've got something wrong or not, is they're slightly over. So they need a slight bit of tension on them to get this cam to close fully. So you can see the brake shoes are actually pressed out a little bit. And it may be when all of the system is under tension and you've got the cable in place, that takes up that slack. And then when the cable gets pulled, that's what moves the cams out. They're very strong springs, so it's actually quite hard to push it by hand. These arms, you can see how there's that slot in there, and that's for the cable to fit in. So the cable gets clamped through this little sort of tapered, it's not tapered, but it's just a little sort of clamp bolt with a hole through it. So the end of the cable goes through that. You do that up tight, that's what clamps the cable to this. Then the cable goes down and around this pulley, and hopefully, I haven't actually tried this yet, but it in theory comes out under there, misses all of this, and comes to the middle here and then into the compensator mechanism. There is a separate piece, which is this one, which I think there's two little spaces, and that bolts in there somewhere. There's two other little pulleys that go in here. You can see these pins are what stop the cable from jumping out, I guess. But I don't have those pulleys, so I need to either see if I can buy those or make some. So that's what gets the cable from coming straight here to bend and head up to the wheels. There was some discussion on the forums about whether or not these arms should be bent, and apparently they shouldn't be. Supposedly the story is people get upset seeing a straight line here going down to a thing here, but apparently that is how they're supposed to be, even though it means the cable is pulling a little bit to one side, which is interesting. I'll see what all that looks like when I've actually got all the pulleys in place and I can run the cable. So that's all in place. The other good thing was I was able to replace all of these, I think they're 5/16 BSF bolts. I had reused some of the old ones before, and all the heads were rounded off, which is really annoying. So one of the last orders I did, I bought a whole bunch of those. So I was able to fit all of those. I have tried just sliding the brake drums on, and they do all fit, which is, well, that could be a good thing or a bad thing. It means they're not too big, but of course the drums could be worn, which would make them loose. But again, I'm not really going to know until I can put the whole system together. At the back, we now sort of get to see a little bit more about how all the system works, although at the moment I don't have the little cotter pins that go through here that actually lock these to the shafts. But this connection here is for the cable, which works the front and the rear brakes. And you can see how if this is pinned to the shaft, this arm works on the back of this. So when the cable pulls, it pulls this lever, which transfers it across to the other side. And the handbrake kind of works in reverse. There's actually a rod that goes from the handbrake mechanism here, here. So this will be under tension, which pulls that little control up, and there's a rod that goes back down to this one. And you can see how that one just works the rear brakes for the handbrake, which is kind of neat. I looked into what the best grease to use was on these things. So normally I use sort of copper grease on most things if I ever want them to come undone again. But because these are stainless steel, steel and aluminium all mixed together, I didn't want to use one of the metal type greases. Apparently that can cause problems with corrosion. So I used a good quality moly grease, just the sort of grey stuff, and put an absolute minimum amount, same around the cams and things like that. Inside here, so these shafts go into this casting, and there needs to be a felt pad inside there, which I didn't have, but I came up with an idea, which this is my little kit of all sorts of Dremel parts, but these little Dremel kits come with these little felt polishing pads, and they're almost the right diameter. So I was able to use a wad punch just to make that a little bit smaller and use those as the felt pads inside that axle casing. I am a little bit confused as to how exactly that gets lubricated, because there's no grease nipples or anything on here. The ends of these shafts are hollow, so I'm presuming oil is somehow meant to make its way slowly through that felt pad into the end of the tube to help lubricate all of these, but I don't know how well that's actually going to work. These shafts do have little grooves cut in them where those rotating surfaces are. And the other tiny thing I had to do was reverse these bolts for the bush. I had them the other way around with the heads on this side, but they're slightly too long, so the ends of the threads would interfere with the brake shoes. I think that's the only other thing I've done is put a little bit more of the adjuster mechanism type stuff in place there. I was worried about them hitting the gear lever, but you can just turn them, which is good. They just clear, and there's actually a sort of indent on that, so that when it rotates, it locks into position. You can hear it clicking, so it's like that, because of course this moves with the handbrake, which is an interesting little system. And I think that's basically all I managed to do today. That literally took me all day to figure that out, to make sure I had all the parts correct, get everything in the right orders, clean everything, all the while trying to avoid getting grease on the actual linings. But I guess that's another little bit of progress. With the oil piping, thanks to the people who pointed out to me what that second takeoff port was for. I should have realized that just with the engine upside down. I couldn't see it, but I knew it was there. Somewhere in behind here, there's an oil feed, and that's to lubricate the intermediate gear. And I actually have the correct pipe for that. That's what this pipe is for. You can see how it sort of reached down and then back up. So I'm just waiting for parts this week then, I guess, and I'll try and sort out the rest of the oil system. I do need to figure out those missing pulleys. This is the one for the rear cable. It's kind of brass or bronze or something, and I'm wondering if I can make one out of steel with a brass bush in the middle, just because I don't have any brass that big, and getting brass bar like that's tricky and expensive. The other thing worth mentioning is getting those brake shoe springs on can be a real pain. So I have this tool that I made from a screwdriver. I think I made this for my little MGB there, but I used it on the Austin, and now I've used it on the Riley as well. And with this, you can sort of hook it under the end of the spring and get a good strong pull on the thing to be able to pull it onto the little lugs on the brake shoes there. But it's looking quite good.